Today's episode is brought to you by Positively Productive Systems, whose mission is to be the antidote to your stress and to provide compassionate productivity resources and coaching that help you heal and achieve. Be sure to check out both free and paid resources at positivelyproductive.com/resources. The reason it's so important to me to talk about trauma is because I understand personally and professionally how it impacts our efforts to build a productive, happy life. We need to consider it when we develop systems and habits, yet too often we see productivity as this separate, structured thing. We look outside ourselves to create a plan without realizing we need to work with what's inside in order to bring that plan to fruition. And not only do we forget to take trauma into account, we all too often miss the signs and see our struggles as something else related to discipline or willpower or even skill. You're listening to the Positively Living Podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Zawrotny, founder of Positively Productive Systems and a productivity coach certified in positive psychology and stress management. Join me as we explore ways to live a more proactive, positive life with episodes on productivity, self-awareness, mindset, entrepreneur life, habits and systems, simplicity, fun, and more. I understand overwhelm personally as a multi-passionate entrepreneur, wife and mom to kids and cats, and as a caregiver. I'm here to help you choose what's right for you so you can do less, live more, and breathe easier. Sound good? Let's get to it. Welcome to the Positively Living Podcast. I'm your host, Lisa, and I'm especially thankful you've joined me today because the topic we're exploring is a huge part of why I do what I do and a concept I want to share with as many people as possible. I suppose that can be said for every episode, but this one is extra special because it's shaped how I coach in such a unique way. It's the reason I approach productivity the way I do. It's a topic that's crucial for understanding ourselves and others. Trauma. More specifically, we're talking about why we need to be trauma-informed in life, though today we'll look at it in the context of productivity. We'll explore what a trauma-informed approach is, why it's not just for therapists, and needs to be adopted by all of us, and how it's not only compassionate, but also essential for sustainable productivity. In the very first season of the podcast, I invited a special guest to join me as a way to create a foundational understanding for us. Mallory Jackson joined me to explain what living a trauma-informed life means in episode 29. As an assistant professor in human services and chemical dependency counseling, she was able to bring both a clinical and community-based perspective. I appreciated that she could explain trauma in an accurate academic way so we could also be trauma-informed. She wanted to take what her counseling students study and share it with a larger community, and this was a perfect opportunity. Our conversation was able to help her students see how life coaching, as I approach it, can support therapists in their efforts. We all work together, and the more that we do that and the more that we understand this topic better, the better off we'll all be. 200 episodes later, and that foundational conversation not only remains one of the most popular episodes, second only to another episode she also did with me, it reminds us of our connection with our past and each other. If you'd like to dig into the psychology and details behind trauma a bit more, you'll want to queue up that episode next and follow it with Mallory's second interview in episode 53, where she helps us understand how we are codependent and what to do about it. These episodes, which I've included in the show notes, are ranked number 1 and number 2, respectively, of all time since the start of the podcast. And if this topic interests you, I know you will love them. The reason it's so important to me to talk about trauma is because I understand personally and professionally how it impacts our efforts to build a productive, happy life. We need to consider it when we develop systems and habits, yet too often we see productivity as this separate, structured thing. We look outside ourselves to create a plan without realizing we need to work with what's inside in order to bring that plan to fruition. And not only do we forget to take trauma into account, we all too often miss the signs and see our struggles as something else related to discipline or willpower or even skill. I've experienced my fair share of trauma, but didn't always realize that's what you'd call it. I thought trauma was limited to major catastrophes, to those fighting wars and suffering great loss. And it most certainly does apply to them, but it also applies to us when we look back on a childhood of neglect or bullying, when we realize that caregiving took more out of us than we ever had available to give. That caregiving part is something I experienced. From 2007 to 2011, I was a caregiver for my mom who had Alzheimer's. I moved her into our home while pregnant with my first child and cared for them both until 2010 when we welcomed our second child. At one point, I had an elderly mother struggling to function, along with a toddler and an infant. Most of the time when I tell people about this experience, their reaction says it all. Oh, that must have been so difficult. Yeah, it was. I had many moments of frustration daily and intense sadness, wrapped up in a weariness that all these years later, I cannot forget. It still feels visceral. But I also had joy. I took on this role with determination, feeling lucky to be able to do what I did, and it wasn't all bad. It took me years after this experience to honor and accept that I had experienced trauma. I grieved the loss of my mother in pieces while she was still alive, all while being on alert, monitoring everyone's progress, my children's growth, and my mother's decline. I had to ensure everyone was safe and that their needs were met. And that included me, although I was often at the bottom of the list or falling off. Toward the end, I had to make some heartbreaking decisions in order to protect my children from the woman who raised me, whom I had at one time trusted with my life. My body and soul were weary, but I had to get up and fight daily. And when I describe it this way, it feels obvious. All of this, trauma. Still, I didn't acknowledge it for a while because I had it better than others. But I've learned over time that we do not compare our trauma. We must understand it for what it is, honor it within us, and find ways to heal and live as fully as we are able. As you might imagine from what I just shared, I carry that trauma with me, and sometimes I feel fine, and sometimes I feel anything but. And I know I'm not the only one. We all have trauma, and we all carry it with us, and we all deal with it differently. What that looks like will vary depending upon the type of trauma, person, time, and support available. What's going on scientifically? Trauma affects the brain's emotion networks and can make us overreact or even underreact to stressful situations. It can create fixed neural networks that are isolated from other parts of the brain, making us stuck in the past and resistant to change. Whether big or small, trauma can leave lasting effects on our minds and bodies. It can show up in so many ways, looking like anxiety or difficulty concentrating. It can manifest itself in physical symptoms. In our first episode on trauma that I mentioned earlier, Mallory had suggested a book by Bessel van der Kolk called The Body Keeps the Score. It's been recommended multiple times over, and whenever we talk about physical manifestations of stress and trauma, I think of this book. It is in my Amazon recommendations list on the resources page of the Positively Productive website. If you go to positivelyproductive.com/resources, scroll down to the frequently recommended books section. Click that link and all the books we talk about on the podcast can be found there, including that one. So let's talk about the link between trauma and productivity. We just established that a trauma experience can affect our minds and bodies. This includes energy levels, motivation, and ability to focus. Exactly. Those are key components of productivity. Makes sense, right? And all of the responses we've talked about are stress responses. And if you've spent any time with me at all, you already know how chronic stress and productivity work together, or don't, as the case may be. So it makes sense that trauma impacts productivity in a similar way. When we're operating from a place of stress or fear, our brains prioritize survival over tasks like planning or goal setting or getting things organized. And this can lead to procrastination, avoidance, complete sense of overwhelm. If you think this is what burnout sounds like, you're absolutely right. It's critical that we look at our trauma response to see if that's what's causing the breakdown. The reason that I wanted to approach productivity differently, compassionately, is because of my own experiences with it. Once again, I went through something and I thought, this has to change. I remember how hard I pushed myself to get stuff done, all the expectations behind what I needed to do in the first place, and then how when I was searching for options to be as efficient as I possibly could be, which I needed desperately during my time as a caregiver, all the suggestions were generic and rarely took into account my unique situation. It was so frustrating, and they'd often be critical too. I would feel less than, not understood, not being given support in a way that would work for me, but rather that I wasn't doing something right. They'd often be so critical, and I'd get frustrated because they were thoughtless suggestions with phrases like, can't you just, and which I want to eradicate from the language, and worse yet, well, just do what I did. The thing is that these comments, which I still see, are not just from internet trolls. They're also from professionals that proclaim they have a solution for you to be more productive. All of these are incredibly dismissive and shaming, and I vowed to no longer do that to myself and to make sure it didn't happen to others as well. I knew there had to be a better way that didn't involve destroying myself in the name of getting stuff done, and that it had acknowledged all I'd been through, but was still effective. And there was, and I found it, and now I'm sharing it. My compassionate productivity approach, which I realized in retrospect relies heavily on positive psychology, is not only kinder, it's even more effective. It's a win-win. I take a person-first approach that recognizes each of us as unique individuals with different life experiences and challenges that we consider before ever bringing in the productivity solution options. My approach emphasizes not only compassion for each other, but self-compassion, which I think can be harder because we can be so demanding of ourselves. If we are to find the best ways to optimize our lives so we can achieve realistic, sustainable productivity, we must not only understand our limitations, we must accept them and work with them. We need to understand how trauma affects our focus and energy, and perhaps more than anything, we need to forgive ourselves when things don't go right, because that kindness will encourage the resilience we need to keep trying. And that continued effort that we make and the consistency that comes with it, that's where the magic happens when it comes to being productive. If all of this is a new concept to you, if you have been in go mode, in push mode, in forcing yourself to get stuff done, and you'd love to shift to finessing, but it feels like a lot, know that I'm here to help. That's what all these conversations on the podcast are about. And as we close this episode today, I want to encourage you to seek out support where you can. If you have friends to talk to, do so. Talk about trauma. Being trauma informed also means being willing to talk about it. Make it a standard topic of conversation. There's a joke. It's like, I'm just not about small talk. I'm going to be like, forget your favorite color. What's your latest trauma? And as much as I joke about that, there's a realness in it, in acknowledging each other and understanding that we all go through this. And if we have that understanding and that kindness with each other, imagine what we can accomplish. So have those conversations, explore therapy if that's an option for you. And if you'd like to take what you know about what you've gone through and maybe are going through, and take that information and design the best personalized productivity plan from it, let's talk. This is what I'm here for. This is what I do. And if you are like I am and want to avoid phone calls at all costs, no worries. You can message me via my website on my Connect page or by social media. Send me a DM. I am happy to chat. I answer all my DMs. Let's start with a chat and we'll take it from there. Thank you again for joining me today. I'm always grateful for our time together, and I hope that this topic especially sits with you, stays with your heart, and helps you feel encouraged as you head back into your daily life. Take heart and remember that embracing a trauma-informed approach and prioritizing self-compassion is the way to help you cultivate a healthy and sustainable relationship with productivity. Thank you for joining me today. Your time is precious and limited, and I'm honored you chose to spend it with me. If you have feedback, questions, or want to schedule a chat, head to positivelyproductive.com/connect. And if you are looking for any of the resources referenced on the podcast, from books to products to training and more, go to positivelyproductive.com/resources.